is a long haul, and that it is necessary that victims have themselves organized. And it is the organization of victims in South Africa that have now transformed our victims into activists for human rights. And you refer to Kulimani, which means speak out. And it was a way of mobilizing victims to fight for their own rights. And now, because the TRC in South Africa didn't go after those business corporations that benefited from the apartheid system, you are now pursuing them using the Alien Tort Claims Act of the United States. I want to thank you very much for this presentation. And as you said, during the interactive questions and answer period, you may provide more revealing information. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is at the stand already. George, please proceed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, distinguished commissioners, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I want to begin by thanking the TRC for this opportunity to be able to share with you. A few months back, my country, Kenya, used to stand in the so-called League of Proud Nations that had not descended the route of violence. I'm afraid that as I stand, I can no longer claim to come from such a country, because we too decided to follow the inglorious example of others, even though we knew very well that it doesn't lead to good places. So as I stand here, I am sharing ideas and thoughts as a person who also comes from a country that has recently decided to also hold a Truth Commission, although in our case we have decided to call ours Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission. And I do notice in your logo there, you call yours TRC, but your motto is actually Truth, Justice and Reconciliation. And I also want to thank Karen and the Guggenheim Foundation for the opportunity to come here. It's good to see old acquaintances, Commissioner Kafumba Kone, who I first met in Nairobi in 1996. I hope he remembers. I still remember your Quranic wisdom those many years back. And I also want to thank Commissioner Ambassador Coleman for giving us time last year when we came to visit here on a research mission. Now, I work with an organization in Kenya called Nairobi Peace Initiative Africa. It deals with issues of peace building, dialogue facilitation, and reconciliation, and we have done that for the last 24 years. The idea being trying to really help ourselves as Africans to try to see what we can learn from each other in order to get our countries from the quagmire of conflict and violence. In my comments this afternoon, I want to do three quick things. I want to start first by giving an introductory background to the research that informs the comments that I'm going to be making here this afternoon. After that introductory comment, I'm going to give some general indications of what is coming out of that research, particularly as it pertains to the theme of our meeting today, which is the whole question of reparations. And then finally, I'm going to be making some suggestions by way of conclusions in terms of how we might learn from that research and how we take the debate about reparations here in Liberia forward. So then first, the research, some introductory comments, that the reflections I'm offering here stem from a research that has been carried out since February 2007 all the way up to March this year, carried out by my organization NPI Africa and the West African Network for Peace Building, WANEP, which is based in Accra, Ghana, but also has a branch here in Monrovia. And the research was titled Transitional Justice Experiences and the TRC Model in Africa, Emerging Lessons and Implications for post-accord societies. Now, this research followed our observation of the rise in importance of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in Africa. And we began to ask ourselves, what were the assumptions that we had about the contribution of truth commissions in Africa, particularly in societies that were emerging from very serious cases of violence, and asking whether we are making assumptions that indeed these commissions were contributing, as we call them, to the quest for truth, number one, and also number two, to the quest for reconciliation. And we wanted to understand how people in various countries understood or what the expectations were of these mechanisms that were in operation. We were also asking the question whether at some point we have become a little bit too obsessed with form, in this case, truth commissions, as opposed to a focus on the goals that we seek in societies that are in transition, as many countries in our continent are at the moment. We looked at a total of 5 countries. Initially, we had wanted to look at 6 countries, but we had to drop one of them. The 6 countries were, number one, a category of 3 countries that had concluded their Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And these were Ghana, Liberia, and inevitably South Africa. The other 3 countries were countries that at that moment of designing the research were contemplating the holding of truth commissions. These were the Democratic Republic of Congo, my own country, Kenya, and Liberia. But even before we could start the research, Liberia did make its decision and started implementing its Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we ended up with a category of 1 country during the research that was in the process of carrying out Truth and Reconciliation Commission process. Now, in terms of then the second element of my comments, general research findings, and particularly as they pertain to the theme of our meeting this afternoon in terms of reparations. Now, before I was involved in this research, because of the work that I have been involved in for many years, 18 years in total of peace making, dialogue facilitation, seeking reconciliation in different parts of this continent, I was of the view that indeed Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are occupying an important part in terms of helping our societies deal with the big question of how do we repair our communities after major divisions of conflict. I'm no longer sure that I stand firmly in that conviction. The reason being that, unfortunately, our findings from research begin to suggest that actually Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in Africa have not come close to meeting the expectations of the people in terms of dealing particularly with the expectations of victims. The good thing is that Shirley has spoken before me, and there is a sense in which we feel that our move towards implementing Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in Africa was largely informed by a somewhat romantic view of what we believed happened in South Africa. But going back to South Africa in the course of this research and listening to various other people, we begin to get the sense that the TRC in South Africa is much more romantically viewed outside of South Africa than it is inside South Africa itself. And therefore, we really have to question ourselves, what is the basis that gives us hope that what we are doing with truth commissions in Africa is actually going to push our societies forward? I do not believe that all is lost. I think we have the opportunity to redeem what I believe to be an important, almost spiritual concept of reconciliation through truth commission. But that requires that the commissions that are currently doing their work and those that come after do take seriously some of the shortcomings that have already been observed by other commissions, particularly what we've just had from the South African experience. So I'll just mention a number of things that come out of this research. Number one, that contrary to the notion inherited from South Africa that suggests that truth commissions serve as vehicles for cathartic healing and moral reinvention of society, the majority of the people that we talked to in Sierra Leone, in Ghana, in this country, and in terms of the people we talked with about their expectations of what was coming for them in Kenya, cited the expectation of material reparations as the major motivation for their ever wanting to appear before truth commissions. And therefore, they are going to measure the success of the commissions to the extent that it was able to implement particularly the recommendations that are made with regard to reparations, and not just reparations of any kind, but also material elements of reparations. And in Kenya, similarly, that people were asked the question, would they like to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? And they answered yes. 99% of the people asked the question answered yes. We want to have a Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission. So they emphatically inserted the word justice in terms of the mechanism they prefer to be held in Kenya. The question that remains to be asked, and we are trying to ask in Kenya still, is what is meant by justice in this case? Is it justice in terms of punitive measures against perpetrators, or is it justice in terms of restorative measures with regard to the victims, or is it both of these elements? Now, across the board, there has been minimum success in terms of the implementation of victim-specific recommendations, particularly those pertaining to reparations. And now, this lack of or slow implementations run counter to the notion and the claim that truth commissions are victim-focused mechanisms of transitional justice, as opposed to prosecutions that we are told only focus on the perpetrator. And therefore, if we want to continue to lay claim to this idea that truth commissions are actually victim-focused mechanisms, we have no choice but to really seriously ensure that whatever recommendations, however modest those recommendations for reparations may be, that they are implemented. Otherwise, we are really doing ourselves and this kind of mechanism a major disservice. Truth commissions have also been seen to be really thin on the idea of justice. And even where we say that transitional justice, of which truth commissions are part, are actually supposed to discourage impunity, we have come to the conclusion from this research that actually truth commissions are increasingly being viewed as vehicles of the very impunity they are supposed to be fighting against. Now, and my suggestion therefore is that truth commissions would need to really work much harder to qualify as avenues for restorative justice, because this was another claim that in many ways came to us from South Africa, that truth and reconciliation commissions are mechanisms for restorative justice. But when then you look at the benchmarks of restorativism, the idea of mutual assessment of the wrong, mutual agreement of what has gone wrong, mutual agreement of how that is going to be repaired, and so on, and even mutual encounters between people that have hurt each other, we see that actually truth commissions in Africa have not met that requirement, and therefore we should hesitate in terms of calling them mechanisms of restorative justice. National unity and reconciliation is another claim. And here, perhaps to just give the example of Ghana, that a number of people, actually the majority of the people we talked to, the question whether the National Reconciliation Commission in Ghana had contributed to national unity and reconciliation, many of them were of the view that they were actually much more divided at the end of the commission than they were before it, largely because they viewed it as a politically motivated witch hunt that was targeted at particular elements, political elements, and so on. And it's no wonder that today, as we prepare for elections in Ghana in December, there is a rise in tension for the first time. There is tremendous fear that Ghana might very easily go the way of Kenya last year and the beginning of this year. And therefore, in conclusion, in terms of the findings of the general findings of this research, to say that one of the major challenges of truth commissions and most of the transitional justice mechanisms that we have had in operation is that they are not designed with great participation of society, and least of all those people on whose behalf we claim to be setting up these mechanisms, the victims. Just a quote from a scholar in South Africa who said that the establishment of the TRC was largely a process driven by a limited number of concerned political parties, NGOs, and individuals, and lacked broad grassroots and collective civil society engagement. And we can tell you from our research that we discovered there was a huge disparity, a huge gap between the perceptions of what I would call civil society, political elites like ourselves, who are at the forefront of proposing the formation of these mechanisms, and the people that these mechanisms are supposed to benefit. Our kind of people seem to be, lost in this romantic notion of moral reinvention of society, the idea of, communities bearing their wrongs before cameras and so on, but they are not the victims. You go to the victims, they have a completely different expectation of what these mechanisms should be about. And therefore, we really need to pay attention to these disparities in expectations and so on. Now, the third piece, very quickly, is then looking at the whole question of reparations and the implications of this. And just saying, for me, one of the saddest things is that we hold up the experience of South Africa as a possibility that we should follow. And therefore, I have what I call the tyranny of example, the tyranny of the example of South Africa, that seems to really have blinded the rest of us in Africa in terms of looking a little bit more carefully in terms of how we might tailor our mechanisms in a manner that might have a higher promise of delivery. So we have South Africa, perhaps a country that is much more endowed in terms of resources and capabilities for implementing the recommendations, particularly pertaining to reparations. And this is also where we encounter the least in terms of the effort to do so. So in some sense, then I ask myself, a country like Liberia, coming out of its struggles of violence for many years, or Sierra Leone, what hope then do we have that they are going to be able to implement the recommendations for reparations if a country that is so well endowed, it has resources, it has possibilities, human and material and so on, has failed so dismally in terms of responding to that? We have to ask ourselves that question, and maybe say what we should be doing is, in our modesty, make recommendations that we believe that our country, our society would be able to afford, and then move the next step and insist on the implementation of those recommendations. For most victims, therefore, reparations actually represent the most tangible evidence of efforts to remedy the past. And as we have been told, that reparations, as opposed to prosecutions or retributive justice, are actually supposed to be an effort on behalf of the victims, as opposed to focusing entirely on the perpetrators. And again, reparations hold the promise of taking the concerns of victims a step beyond other victim-focused approaches, including truth-telling, official acknowledgement, institutional reforms, and so on. This could be said to be victim-focused approaches to transitional justice, but reparations actually holds the highest possibility that we are seen to be directly and tangibly responding to the needs and voices of the victims. And so without directly touching the lives of the victims, these other measures, truth-telling, acknowledgement, and so on, can appear very remote, theoretical, and very empty. I won't go into the details of this. Karen has kindly gifted the Commission with a big tome, the Handbook of Reparations. In there you will find what the editor of that handbook calls the taxonomy of reparations, or a framework of analyzing and assessing reparations. He talks about the scope in terms of the number of beneficiaries that a reparations program may be able to cover. And so you would be measuring the success of the Liberian reparations program first in terms of the scope. Then he talks about the completeness, and here referring to the ability of that mechanism to cover everybody that has been identified within the scope of the reparations. And here to just say that the completeness of the reparations program can be affected by a number of things. One interesting one is if we set the evidentiary bar a little bit too high, then there will be people that will not be able to qualify or appear for reparations. And a good example here is what we had in Ghana about people who lost their property during an operation that was supposed to eradicate holding of goods. And because they did not have documentary evidence, they were not able to go and lay claims before the National Reconciliation Commission because the kind of evidentiary bar that had been set was a little bit too high for some of those victims and so on. Also, the organizational difficulties of truth commissions can make it very difficult for reparations to be complete. And one example here is the tremendous difficulties, organizational difficulties, that the Sierra Leonean Truth Commission had to grapple with. Then there is the whole idea of comprehensiveness. And here it refers to the number of distinct types of wrongs that a commission decides to reparate for. And therefore the question of what do you decide as a commission is compensatable, if I may use that kind of language. And here one of the voices from South Africa is that it's too narrowly defined who was a victim, forgetting some of the structural, historical injustices that people are going to continue to suffer from for many years. But then there is also the suggestion that maybe this might not be the purview of reparations, that what we might be talking about here is distributive justice programs that help to redress structural imbalances and so on. There is complexity, and then there is integrity or coherence of reparations program. Integrity and coherence has both internal and external elements. The internal elements of a reparations program refer to how logically coherent or how logically the various elements of reparations reinforce each other. For example, if I give a compensation check to a victim and continue to deny that they were victimized, then there is no internal coherence. But that internal coherence will be enhanced if the compensation check is also accompanied, say, by an apology, an official acknowledgement that something went wrong, and so on. The external coherence or integrity part of reparations program refers to how we align and reinforce other transitional justice measures, such as if we decide to have criminal trials, or we want to have reforms, or we want to have truth seekings, how these then are also logically reinforcing each other. In conclusion, I just want to make a few suggestions here. One is to talk about symbolism of reparations, that suggesting that perhaps we ought to be de-emphasizing what has been said to be the distinction between material and symbolic reparation. I hold the view that to the extent that very few reparation programs can be said to make material difference to the lives of the victims, then to that extent, and also to the extent that they are not intended as what lawyers like my professor here would call restitutio in integram, that they are not intended to restore victims to their original status before the violation. To that extent then, all reparations are symbolic. They are token reparations. And we should perhaps be moving away from the idea that some are material, some are symbolic, and so on, that all of them are really symbolic reparations. Then secondly, in terms of comprehensiveness of reparations, whether we call them material or symbolic, that in order for these reparations to be comprehensive, they should be conceptualized at various levels, individual, at community, as well as national level, where we can go perhaps at the national level, maybe the direction of South Africa in terms of instituting national days of remembrance or memorials and so on. Then in terms of preparing people to have realistic expectations. I talked about my frustrations just thinking about if South Africa could not do it with the resources that they have, how do we expect that other countries are going to be able to do this? So how do we really then begin to prepare people in terms of having reasonable expectations? And this work is going to require a lot of public education in terms of what we are likely to be recommending as a commission with regard to reparations. We had harrowing stories from Ghana about how the National Reconciliation Commission, in its effort to get people to come and fill up the halls, made, promises about compensation. And then at the end of the day, this has not been forthcoming. We had stories of people that borrowed money to make the journeys back and forth from far places, to record statements, to stay in guest houses, and even buy gifts to their families, only to be shocked at the end of the day when they received only $200 in terms of compensation, way below the amounts that they had spent in terms of trying to get that compensation. Then the idea of how do we focus on the question of broader rebuilding in terms of going beyond these various forms of reparations, looking at how we rebuild society as a whole, how we rebuild our lives, how we rebuild relationships. I think this, for me, is an element that perhaps we should be thinking of how follow-up mechanisms at lower levels of society are going to be implemented so that we address questions of restitution of land, restitution of property, poverty alleviation, affirmative actions for victimized groups, and so on and so forth, should form part of our reparations package. Comprehensive exploration of funding for reparations. That, yes, material reparations can be affordable. Sometimes more in some societies than in others. But we should also not assume that the costs are inconsequential. They cost money. They cost resources. And therefore we should be exploring how, as we visualize the recommendations that we're going to be making, where are these resources going to come from? Including looking at external sources, people that benefited from the atrocities that were committed. Unfortunately, again, the example of South Africa is not very helpful. South African civil society, groups like Hulumani and Shali here, have done a lot of work identifying groups and corporations that we should target with regard to supporting and funding reparations, but we have not made a lot of progress. So that, in that respect, it's not been very helpful, but I don't think we should give up. We should be able to identify other sources of funding that reach beyond our borders. I was reading your papers today, and I think people that have appeared before you have made suggestions for how we should make other countries in Africa that contributed to the wars in this country also participate in the reparations and so on. Delaying declarations of amnesty, awaiting reparations. One of the big problems we encountered in many places, beginning from South Africa, is that Our Truth and Reconciliation Commissions appear to be really soft on people that might be described as perpetrators and very hard on victims. So their applications of amnesties quickly processed, but victims having to wait up until now, and they don't know that they're ever going to be compensated. So is there a possibility that if we are going to be dealing with applications of amnesty, that even at a symbolic level, the very declaration of amnesty to those that have applied is delayed until we are able to figure out how we are going to be dealing with victims, so that perpetrators are not seen to be running ahead of the victim, of their victims, in terms of getting relief. Finally, follow-up mechanisms. I think these cannot be overemphasized. How do we visualize that our recommendations are going to be followed up upon? Do we have mechanisms? Have they been foreseen in the Act? Probably they have been, but how do we really go an extra mile in ensuring that we have mechanisms, whether through national human rights institutions that are following up? And I want to emphasize the point that was made by Charlie, that we also have to work very closely and prepare civil society groups in a manner that they are, and victim groups as well, so that they are able to continue to speak on their own behalf, not this time as victims, but as she has said, as human rights activists. In conclusion then, I would say, I have worked on issues of reconciliation for 18 years in this continent, including here since 1992. And I always held the possibility, and I still hold the possibility, that the continent of Africa can be able to deal with its challenges of violence and divisions and move forward. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions provide us with that possibility. However, the picture that emerges for us from various places is that we are not working hard enough to be able to make that happen. And I would implore this commission that we try and go an extra mile, so that my own country, Kenya, will be looking to the work of this commission and saying, this one made a difference, unlike various others before it. And together I believe that we have the capacity and ability to uplift this continent of Africa that we so much love. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, George, for sharing your research findings with this commission, which in a substantial way has questioned traditional, or if you like, conventional thinking about the TRCs. It raises the issue of material reparation for victims. It also raises the issue of the desire of the people. Most of the time, people want a TRC process, but the outcome of the process normally falls short of the expectations. And as such, TRCs have produced very minimal success in terms of what victims expect. You also raised the issue of reparation. Recommendations should be fully implemented if we are to give true meaning to a TRC process. And then also, the idea that TRC is being viewed as a vehicle for impunity rather than a vehicle for justice. And then reconciliation. Do we actually accomplish reconciliation at the end of our process? And in concluding, you have come to realize that almost all forms of reparation are symbolic, in as much as it does not restore the victim to his previous state. And that we should have a very comprehensive reconciliation process. Reparation process. If there is individual, there should be community, and there should be national reconciliation. And then to manage expectations, there should be massive education about the process and reparation. I want to thank you very much. And we also took note of the advice you have for our commission, that we could make a difference, that Kenya and other institutions coming after us could follow. Thank you very much for your presentation. Before we take the break, we want to thank the entire panel for the collectivity of ideas and views on the subject of reparation. that has been presented to this commission. Andre provided us a philosophical foundation of reparation and what the current practices are and how we can take advantage of the lessons learned from other institutions. And then, of course, Danny tried to focus on the end product of a process of reconciliation, and basically he emphasized the building and strengthening of democracy, which should be rooted in the family. Of course, Shelley brought us a very practical experience of what transpired in South Africa and how we can learn from those lessons. And then George is giving us new thinking about the process and how Liberian TRC can make a difference. Thank you all very much for your presentation. When we return at 3:30, you have questions from commissioners and we have an opportunity to interact on your presentation. Thank you very much. Mr. Hearing Officer, we stand recessed till 3:30.